All right, morning, everyone. This is a beautiful, very springy morning here in Washington, D.C. Today's ICHRRF Speaking Up series, the topic is the role of interfaith, of the interfaith movement in the fight for freedom and justice in South Africa. Our speaker is the esteemed ambassador, His Excellency Anil Sooklal, Ambassador of South Africa. So a short introduction before we go right to it. Ambassador Sooklal is South Africa's Deputy Director General responsible for Asia and the Middle East, a Department for International Relations and Cooperation. His Excellency is also South Africa's BRICS Sherpa, the India-Brazil-South Africa IBSA Sherpa, and the Indian Ocean Rim Association for Regional Cooperation representative as well. And he served as South Africa's G20 Sherpa between 2016 and 2019. He has also served as Chief Director for North Africa, Acting Chief Director for United Nations Political and Global Security Affairs, and the head of the department's Parliamentary office in Cape Town. And he was the coordinator of the substance team of the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in 2001. His previous foreign postings include having been the counselor, the political counselor at the South African Permanent Mission to the United Nations in Geneva, and at the South African High Commission in New Delhi, India. He has served as a member of the Religious Advisory Board of the SABC from Jan to August in 1995, which is when he resigned to take up his post as the country's permanent mission to the United Nations in Geneva. He is the recipient of several international awards. So with that, I invite Ambassador Sooklal to please take the mic.
Thank you, Excellency. Let me at the very outset express my deep appreciation and gratitude to the ICHRRF for giving me this privilege to address your august platform. I have been looking at the excellent work that you have been doing, and I think we have great need for organizations like this internationally. I want to also express my gratitude to Professor Yashwant Pathak, who initiated this activity. In my talk today, I will cover the following areas. I will briefly give context of myself so you know where I'm coming from in addressing this topic. And I will look at, firstly, religion under the apartheid regime, and the nexus between religion and politics in South Africa, the rise of liberation theologies in South Africa, and the consensus on interfaith action against apartheid, and the role of the interfaith movement in the struggle for justice and democracy in South Africa. Firstly, my own background. My great-grandparents arrived in South Africa in 1893. And you may recall that's the year Mahatma Gandhi arrived also in South Africa, where he spent 21 years of his life from 1893 to 1914, and where he formulated his philosophy of ahimsa and satyagraha at the Phoenix Ashram, specifically here in Durban. Between 1860 and 1910, you had the system of indentured Indians arriving in South Africa under British colonial rule to work on the sugar plantations in South Africa. So I'm a product of that movement of Indians from India to South Africa. And upon arrival in South Africa, my grandparents were assigned to a sugar estate in Pongola, which is in the northern part of KwaZulu-Natal, the province where I was born, to go and work in a sugar estate there. And of course, the Indians had the opportunity after the 5-year tenure of contract under indenture to remain in South Africa or to return to India. And in most cases, Indians remained in South Africa, and those that remained were given a plot of land so that they could start a livelihood for themselves. And that's how my grandfather began a life entering into farming, and later he became a landowner and eventually went into business. So from the very early period, the Indians in South Africa brought with them the religious practices and of course, the culture and the language. And given the very harsh conditions under which they had to live in these sugar plantations, if you look at the writings of this period, most of the writers compare the conditions to that of slavery. So the indentured Indians were treated as second-class citizens under very difficult conditions, and no provision was made for the education of the children or for providing proper facilities for them. So they relied much on establishing their own mandirs and their own religious organizations from the very outset. So you'd see that in South Africa, almost from the time that Indians started arriving here, they started building temples, their own temples, using their own limited resources and creating religious organizations. So I grew up in this environment where religion was very much part of our household, and I lived very close to a temple about 5 minutes away. And I recall as a student going to the temple quite often, especially during festivals. And the temple was very much part of our religious life, as was daily religious practices in our homes. And most of the indentured Indians that arrived were very well versed in the religious text. I recall that my father would, on a weekly basis, recite the Ramayana, Tulsidas Ramayana. And you'd find this in most of the Hindu homes, that they were very wedded to the text. Now, of course, what complicated post the indenture period, indenture ended in 1910, and then you had Indians as a permanent entity of South African society. But it was only in 1961 that the government of South Africa declared Indians as citizens of South Africa. Up to 1961, we were not regarded as permanent citizens of the country. So it's still a very recent history. And of course, what complicated the life of the Hindu community, India was the first country that called for sanctions against South Africa in terms of opposing apartheid. And India was instrumental in getting South Africa suspended from the United Nations in 1948. India led that movement globally. And of course, India imposed stringent sanctions on the South African apartheid regime. That in turn, of course, disadvantaged the Hindu community, because henceforth you could have no contact in terms of bringing priests from India and religious practitioners to keep the culture and the faith alive. So we had to depend on our own communities. This was not the case with the other communities. For example, the Muslim world, you still had Maulanas coming from Pakistan. They freely could enter the country. And it was the Hindu community that suffered the most in terms of the religion, culture, and language because of the isolation from India. I went on post school education to go and study at a university, and the way South African society was arranged under apartheid, each community had their own university. So a university was created for the Indian community of South Africa. So those of us of Indian origin had to go to that university. We couldn't choose to go to any other university. There were a number of so-called white universities we could not attend. Likewise, the Black Africans, President Mandela, for example, had to go to Fort Hare. That's where he studied and graduated from. And the so-called colored communities, and university was created for them in the Western Cape, the University of the Western Cape. So even our education system was stratified along race lines. So the University of Durban Westville, where I went and studied, was a university for Indian South Africans. And for my undergraduate degree, I majored in a course called the Science of Religion, basically religious studies, looking at all religions, and Oriental studies, basically looking at the history of Asia. Those were my majors at university. And upon graduating, I continued with my postgraduate studies. And while a student of science of religion, I already recognized the need to have better interfaith understanding, because South Africa, we were so compartmentalized in terms of race. We had our own racially segregated residential areas where Indians could only live amongst Indians, coloreds amongst coloreds, whites had the best part of the country, and the Black Africans were relegated to the worst part of the country. So we all lived basically in compartmentalized societies based on race. So therefore, we did not know much about each other, and including the religious beliefs of each other. So as a student, I, together with my wife, who at that time was also at the university, we started the Science of Religion Society to promote interfaith understanding, at least amongst the university community. And this was in 1982. And this year was also important because in 1982, for the first time, you had in South Africa the beginning of a Hindu Students Association. I was one of the founder members of the Hindu Students Association. It was the first university to have an Hindu Students Association to articulate the challenges being experienced by the Hindu community. And much later, Hindu Students Association were to flourish at other universities once South Africa became a democratic and open society. And this was also the forerunner for the National Hindu Youth Federation that was formed. It was incubated in the Hindu Students Association. In 1984, I was then appointed a lecturer in the Faculty of Theology at the University of South Africa, which is housed here in Pretoria, our capital. And the Faculty of Theology, by and large, focused on Christian theology, although you had them teaching faiths of Asia and the Middle East, but it was taught by white South Africans. So I became the first person of Indian origin to be appointed to the academic staff at the University of South Africa, and the first Hindu in the Faculty of Theology, which was a large faculty of about 80 staff members. I was responsible for the teaching of Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, and also Shintoism and Taoism. And this was important because for the first time, the Hinduism was not taught by a white South African, as was the case in the past, but someone who had academic qualifications in the religion, but also from the religion. And later on, Islam also, you had the appointment of academics from the Muslim community to teach Islam. And already when I was there were two African scholars in the Faculty of Theology responsible for African traditional religions and religious studies in terms of African Christianity. Roughly speaking, the breakdown of South Africa's religious affiliation is that well over 80% of South Africans are of the Christian faith, made up of various denominations, the Catholics, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Pentecostal churches, African traditional indigenous churches, and so forth. Hindus make up about 1.3% of the population, Islam close to 2%, and Jews make up about 70,000 people of the almost 60 million people that is South Africa's population today. Now that's just a very broad sweep of the background. Now coming specifically to religion under apartheid. Under the apartheid regime, religion was a powerful instrument in legitimizing and entrenching the political system of apartheid, that is racial segregation. Several white Christian churches actively promoted racial divisions through the political philosophy of apartheid. There's still a debate whether the church itself was the key mover of entrenching the apartheid philosophy in South Africa. The largest of these Christian denominations was the so-called Dutch Reformed Church, the NGK, the Duitse Gereformeerde Kerk, the NGK, or the Dutch Reformed Church as it came to be known, which came to be known as the official religion of the National Party government, the apartheid government that came to power and institutionalized racial segregation and apartheid in 1948. The Dutch Reformed Church arrived in South Africa in the late 19th century, 17th century, after the Calvinist reforms in Europe had entrenched the idea of predestination, and the Synod of Dort in the Netherlands had proclaimed this church as the community of the elect in 1690. The church gained recognition as the state religion in 1651, and the Dutch East India Company, as the extension of the state in Southern Africa, established the first Dutch Reformed Church in the Cape of Good Hope in 1652. All of the Dutch Reformed churches share similar Calvinistic beliefs and Presbyterian organization. This doctrine asserts that God is eternal, infinite, wise, and just. He has planned the life and faith of each individual, and the chosen one the chosen one are saved as long as they adhere to the church's teachings. The Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, is the final authority in religious matters. As Black Africans and people of the so-called colored and Indian community converted to the Christian religion, in particular the Dutch Reformed Church, church members debated the issue of separatism. Pressure grew for racially segregated congregations because the white Dutch Reformed Church, under the apartheid system, was not happy to allow members of other race groups entry into the white church based on the supremacy of the white race. So in 1881, the Dutch Reformed Mission Church was established as a separate colored church to serve the colored community. In 1910, the NGK in Africa was established for Black Africans. And in 1951, the Indian Dutch Reformed Church was formed. So racial separation was widely accepted in the church, as many Afrikaners came to believe that their own survival as a community was threatened by the emergence of these other branches, and that they could have their own churches, but they had to worship separately and not in the same Dutch Reformed Church exclusively reserved for the Afrikaner white community. As this system of apartheid came under pressure from within the country and internationally during the 1970s and 80s, when you had sanctions being applied to the South African government by a number of countries internationally, the church became an impediment to political reform due to its commitment and support of the apartheid regime. So religion played also an oppressive role in entrenching and in reinforcing the apartheid philosophy in South Africa. The leaders of the other mainstream Christian churches often spoke out in opposition to apartheid, but church members disagreed on the tactics for expressing their views. Most church groupings, and I would say this was true also of the other religious communities, were intimidated by the might and force of the apartheid regime, because if you opposed and spoke out, you were arrested, you were placed under house arrest, or you were placed in detention without trial, and in many cases, people also disappeared. So it was a very repressive and powerful regime. So most of the organized churches didn't want to overtly be seen as opposing the apartheid state. But from within these churches, the Anglican, the Presbyterians, the Catholic, the Methodists, the African independent churches, the Muslim groupings, the Hindus, and including some of the Jews, individuals from these organizations started speaking out against apartheid and became leading lights in the struggle against apartheid. So religious alliances provided a means of coordinated opposition to apartheid while minimizing the public exposure of church leaders and its congregants. In 1968, we had a very important development within the religious dimension of South Africa and apartheid. The South African Council of Churches, an umbrella body, was born, and it was very active in the anti-apartheid movement. The South African Council of Churches not only openly opposed apartheid, but also supported those who contravened the race laws of the apartheid regime. For example, we had the Mixed Marriages Act. You couldn't have marriages between people of the white race with the black races. So the Mixed Marriages Act was there to ensure that the so-called purity of the white race was maintained. And even if you had an alliance between a white person and a black person, they were charged and imprisoned. It was not allowed. We also had the Immorality Act. Now, this was a very controversial act, the Immorality Act, where if you were found there was a liaison between a white person and a black person, this was transgressing what was called the Immorality Act. And they were also incarcerated and severely punished. So they didn't want any mixing of the races. So the South African Council of Churches, under the leadership of Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu in the 1980s, withheld cooperation with the state in protest against the apartheid regime. The South African Council of Churches leaders were outspoken in the political views and organized numerous peaceful protests and addressed numerous political rallies against racial injustice and gross violation of human rights. Now, Archbishop Tutu played a seminal role in bringing the voice of religion into the mainstream of opposition politics. And this had an impact on the other religious communities as well, the Hindus and the Muslims and the Jews. So what you saw is that the opposition that started growing from within the mainstream Christian religion started impacting on the other communities. Now, within the Muslim community, you had in 1945 an umbrella body created, the Muslim Judicial Council, which was located in the Western Cape, where the majority of so-called Muslims resided, including those that descended from the Malaysian Peninsula, who arrived in South Africa in the mid-17th century, either as slaves or political exiles from Malaysia and Indonesia. Most prominent of these was Sheikh Yusuf, who came from a royal family, but exiled by the Dutch colonizers of Indonesia to South Africa. And the beginnings of Islam in South Africa dates to that period. And in the 70s, you saw the formation of the Muslim Youth Movement, the Muslim Students Association, and later the Call of Islam, which came to play a very important role in articulating struggle politics against apartheid under the leadership of people like Maulana Farid Isaac, Hassan Solomon, and Ibrahim Rasool, who later became Premier of the Western Cape Province and our ambassador to the USA as well under the democratic dispensation. Now, within the Hindu community, in 1907, Swami Shankarananda, an Arya Samaj Swami from India, arrived in South Africa in 1907. And one of the things that struck him was that the Hindu community was not a coherent community in terms of leadership and articulating the views and the challenges they were experiencing. So he convened the first South African Hindu conference in May 1912. It was attended by about 300 delegates from 44 Hindu organizations. And this culminated in the formation of the South African Hindu Mahasabha, the so-called umbrella body of Hindus in South Africa. Then during the late 40s, early 50s and 60s, you have found the emergence of so-called neo-Hindu movements taking root in South Africa. The Ramakrishna Mission, the Divine Life Society, the Saiva Siddhanta Sangam, the Arya Samaj, and later on in the 70s, the Hare Krishna movement all established themselves as mainstream Hindu religious organizations in South Africa. The Jewish community, by and large, was made up of members of the white community. Jews in South Africa arrived during British rule, during the movement of Europeans to South Africa in the 19th century. And as I indicated, from a small number of 4,000, they grew at the height, it grew to about 90,000. Currently, there are about 70,000 Jews. But generally, most of the Jewish organizations were seen as being complicit in fostering ties between Israel and the apartheid regime. The apartheid regime had very close ties with the Israeli government. They also had diplomatic relations and strong military ties. But from within the Jewish community, you also had progressive Jewish voices. And the progressive Jewish voices was represented by the South African Union for Progressive Jews and Jews for Social Justice. But from all of these communities, you had individuals that were championing the cause of justice and opposing the unjust apartheid regime. More than the religious communities itself, it was individual leaders from these communities that carried the torch in terms of opposing apartheid. Now, a very important development took place in the 1980s. The National Party government in 1983 floated the idea of creating a tricameral, three-chamber parliament. The main chamber being for the House of Assembly, being for the white community, and then a House of Representatives for the so-called colored community, and thirdly, the House of Delegates for the Indian community. Now, of course, the apartheid regime was coming under intense international pressure and pressure locally. So in order to perpetuate its white domination and supremacy, they came up with creative ways in continuing to rule South Africa along racial lines and according to the apartheid philosophy. As early as the 1970s, they formulated what was called the homeland policy. And this is where they divided pockets of South Africa's land into homelands for the African community. In total, some 13% of South Africa's landmass was given to about 10 homelands, and the other 87% reserved for the white community. So you can see that they thought up various schemes in order to show and demonstrate to the domestic as well as international community that they are accommodating all race groups. But this was just smoke screens to perpetuate the apartheid regime. And as a result of the tricameral parliament, and unfortunately you had members from the Indian community and the colored community, and of course the African community, that were complicit and seen as partners in apartheid in becoming partners in the tricameral system. Despite the overwhelming majority of Indians and coloreds rejecting the scheme, the National Party went ahead and institutionalized this tricameral parliament in 1984. But this was a catalyst to galvanize all the opposition forces against apartheid in the country, including the religious leadership. And on 20th August 1983, the United Democratic Front was launched in a place called Mitchell's Plain near Cape Town. Delegates from over 575 organizations and a public rally attended by over 10,000 launched the United Democratic Front. Now, the United Democratic Front, interestingly, was a broad umbrella of organizations, but brought together, and it was the brainchild of a church leader, Reverend Alan Busak. Now, Reverend Alan Busak was a dynamic anti-apartheid activist. He was from the so-called colored community, and speaking at an anti-South African Indian Council. Now, the South African Indian Council was a so-called stooge organization that brought together so-called leadership from the Indian community to partake in this tricameral parliamentary system. So you had an organization formed to rally against the South African Indian Council. And Alan Busak spoke at a rally of this organization in January 1983 in Johannesburg. And it was there that he called for a united front of churches, civic association, religious leaders, trade unions, student organization, and sport bodies. And this resulted in the founding of the United Democratic Front. Alan Busak is also credited for being this founding father of liberation theology in South Africa. And he articulated, first and foremost, liberation theology within the Christian community and the theology of protest. Very much influenced by the liberation theology of Latin America and people like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi as well. His seminal work, Farewell to Innocence, which was his doctoral thesis, is known as one of the reference points of liberation theology in South Africa. So just to give you that background in terms of what was happening within the religious paradigm in South Africa under the apartheid regime. So as I've indicated, during the 1980s, you saw agitation internally and the coming together of various formations, including religious groupings, to oppose apartheid. It was in 1984 when I went and was appointed to the academic staff at UNISA, the University of South Africa, that my colleague, a fellow lecturer, Dr. Kerry Labbe, who was also from the Dutch Reformed Church, he was a pastor, but whose congregation was in the Indian community, the Indian Christian community in a Indian township in South Africa, where he had a church. And he was approached by Archbishop Desmond Tutu to look at creating an interfaith organization. Now, this came about because Archbishop Tutu was approached by the World Conference on Religion and Peace, a global interfaith organization with its headquarters in Geneva. And they were going to have the Fourth World Assembly in Nairobi in August 1984. And Archbishop Tutu, given the developments that I spoke of under the United Democratic Front, which brought religious leaders into the mainstream of protest politics from all communities, Archbishop Tutu launched the idea that we should create an interfaith platform and that we should fight this apartheid regime as united as faith communities. So in 1984, we founded the South African chapter of the World Conference on Religion and Peace. And Archbishop Tutu and Reverend Busak became our patrons, and Dr. Kerry Labbe became its first chairperson, and I was elected onto the executive of the WCRP. It brought together people of different faiths, some belonging to religious organizations, but in the main, the interfaith organization was not warmly embraced by the religious groupings. Many saw us dabbling in politics, and as I've indicated, there was a reluctance to get involved in mainstream politics for various reasons. The fear factor, and in many instances, many felt that religion and politics don't mix. But of course, there was a younger, more dynamic generation across the board that felt that we need to speak out from our faith communities and from our respective belief systems, fighting the injustice of apartheid, the inhumanity, the mass incarceration of our leaders, the killing of our leaders in detention, the disappearance of our leaders. So this brought us into a common grouping under the World Conference on Religion and Peace. And this became a very dynamic interfaith organization. First, we had the national chapter based in Johannesburg, and then we created a chapter in KwaZulu-Natal in Durban. And in 1985, when I moved to the University of Durban Westville, I was instrumental in setting up that chapter and served as its chairperson from 1985 to 1994 when I left to join government. And we also had a chapter created in Cape Town, headed by Ibrahim Rasool, as I indicated. He was also, and Farid Isaac, Ibrahim Rasool became premier of our Western Cape province under the democratic dispensation. Now, the organization located itself among those conducting dialogue around practical matters such as justice and peace, sharing the conviction that doctrine divides but humanity unites. The WCRP, furthermore, did not view itself as an exercise in abstract interfaith dialogue, focusing merely on the analysis of religious concepts or customs, but proceeds from the joint commitment to the struggle for justice and peace in South Africa. This became an organization that soon became the coalface of the religious community, championing for justice, peace, and fight, and of course, articulating opposition against the apartheid regime, calling for a democratic dispensation in South Africa. So the WCRP emerged as the South African Forum for Interfaith Dialogue between religious leaders who were committed to the struggle for justice. Through its regular forums, it also supplied believers with a theological appreciation of the other. As much as we were united in championing the cause of justice and dialogue between our faiths, we also learned about other faith communities through this interaction. We were therefore not a faith community, much less a collective of faith communities. Rather, it was an organization of progressive individuals and a few organizations drawn from various faith groups, and a collective made up of those who join it by accepting its basic tenets and its commitments to striving for peace and justice and a democratic dispensation in South Africa. From its very inception, WCRP was determined to be another vehicle for accelerating the fight for justice for the people of South Africa. And having prominent people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was later in 1984 awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, this gave a further impetus and gravity to the Interfaith organization. One of the first things we also did was to organize an annual Desmond Tutu Peace Lecture to honor and in 1984 to honor Archbishop Tutu for his Nobel Peace Prize. The first lecture was to have been delivered by Tutu himself in September 1985. But this lecture was banned by the government because the state, as the state indicated, the reason for banning the meeting was that the police had reasons to apprehend that the safety of members of the public and property would be seriously endangered by a gathering organized by the World Conference on Religion and Peace. Now you can see how afraid the state was in terms of the activities being undertaken by the WCRP, because it galvanized and brought people together in a united form. Previously, we all acted from within our respective communities, but here we galvanized in totality, and we formed an alliance with other structures, political, civic structures, business structures that were all opposing apartheid, sport bodies, and so forth. And that lecture, apart from being banned and not being allowed, the state also refused visas to 6 of the 9 international religious leaders that were invited to that lecture, including prominent persons that were invited from India. And one of the aims of instituting this lecture was to remind all people of faith to put into practice those sanctions and traditions of justice and peace which are inherent in their respective religions. During more than a decade, we learned to work together for common goals while respecting one another's different beliefs and practices. In line with this view, we invited representatives of the various faiths annually to deliver the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Peace Lectures. In 1996, His Holiness the Dalai Lama delivered the keynote address. Now, just to show how important a factor this became, in 1987, the African National Congress, which was banned in South Africa, invited the leadership of the WCRP to Lusaka in Zambia to come and have a meeting with them in order to see what the role of religious communities will be in a post-apartheid South Africa. Now, Archbishop Tutu led that delegation in 1987, and I was very privileged to be part of that delegation. And of course, contact between South Africans and the banned African National Congress was prohibited. So we went against the apartheid government policy by having contact with the banned African National Congress in meeting with the leadership. We met with the leadership of the African National Congress in Lusaka for 2 days, and prominent executive members of the African National Congress that met with us and discussed the role that we are playing as the interfaith organization in opposing apartheid and how we should position ourselves in terms of the role of religious communities in a post-apartheid South Africa, included people like Mac Maraj. Mac Maraj was banned and imprisoned in Robben Island for over 10 years, together with Nelson Mandela in Robben Island, and then he went into exile. People like Joe Slovo, the head of the South African Communist Party, hailing from a Jewish background, Joe Nhlanhla, who was later to become our Minister of Intelligence, and Steve Schwetwe, who was later to become Minister of Sport under the Mandela government. All of these people that we met were very senior executive members of the ANC. I recall that while we were there, this was supposed to be a clandestine meeting. It was reported in the news in South Africa. And it was then indicated that all of us will be arrested by the apartheid regime upon our arrival back into South Africa. So we were highly nervous and anxious. Some of us were taken in for questioning in terms of the nature of the meeting and the contact we had with the African National Congress. But you could see from a very early period, the work of the Interfaith organization was recognized by the political leadership in exile as much as the role that he was playing internally in opposing apartheid. And it was in the wake of the momentous changes that was taking place in South Africa with the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990, that Albie Sachs was a stalwart of the African National Congress and one of the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement. Albie Sachs hails from a Lithuanian Jewish background, born in South Africa, studied law at the University of Cape Town and became a prominent lawyer representing those that were incarcerated and charged under the apartheid regime, those are protesting. Albie Sachs was imprisoned for 5 months, and then upon his release, he went into exile to the UK, where he completed his PhD in law at the University of Sussex, and then he moved in 1988, he moved to Mozambique as the ANC leadership in exile. And while he was in Mozambique, of course, the apartheid regime did everything to try and get rid of the leadership of the African National Congress, internally as well as externally. A bomb was placed in his car, and Albie Sachs lost an arm and an eye in that bombing by the apartheid regime. But Albie Sachs went on to become a member of a very respected judge in our constitutional court in 1994 under the Mandela government. And it was Albie Sachs that put forward the idea that the interfaith community should come together to try and look at what how religion would feature in a post-apartheid South Africa. And he said that he called for the religious communities to come together and articulate a religious charter which would encapsulate the rights and expectations of religious people. And this led to a remarkable consultative process that was initiated by us at the WCRP. It comprised of regional workshops where we had representatives from different religions met in June 1992 and produced an initial draft that was circulated for feedback amongst all the religious communities. And this process culminated in a national interfaith conference that was held in Pretoria in November 1992 and was attended by 150 representatives of all religious communities throughout the country. And the Declaration on Religious Rights and Responsibilities was adopted after 3 days of debate. I was very much part of this process and was very privileged to be one of the authors of this declaration. And this declaration was to play an important role in terms of enshrining religious freedom. Under apartheid, as I indicated, the DRC was the state religion, but under the democratic dispensation, we were to have a secular government, and where religious freedom was enshrined in our constitution that was adopted in 1996 under Chapter 31 of our constitution, where the rights of religious communities were affirmed. Now, also to show you that the impact of the Interfaith organization, President Mandela was released from jail after 27 years of incarceration in 1990 February. Now, within 2 months of him being released from jail, he invited us to the headquarters of the African National Congress, Luthuli House, it's called today, then it was called Shell House, and a delegation, again led by Archbishop Tutu, went to meet with President Mandela. And President Mandela, I was very privileged again to be part of the delegation, paid homage to the role that we played as the Interfaith organization in fighting apartheid, organizing ourselves as a faith community, and working with the other protest movements in tandem to dismantle the apartheid regime. And this was a clear acknowledgement. As I indicated, in 1987, we were invited by the ANC in exile to meet the leadership, and as early as within 2 months of President Mandela's release from prison, he gave us audience and also called upon us to play an active role in terms of shaping our new constitution, and especially the provisions around religious rights and religious freedom. And the Interfaith organization must take credit for the fact that today South Africa is a multi-cultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-racial society, and the enshrinement within our constitution of religious freedom is something that we cherish today, and the religious communities live in harmony in South Africa today. And that's why Archbishop Tutu in 1994 characterized South Africa as the rainbow nation. We are the most diverse African country in terms of racial groupings, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of religious makeup, and that's the strength of the fabric of South African society today. And the Interfaith organization played a seminal role in championing against the apartheid regime and ensuring that the democratic dispensation made sure that all religious communities have equal shareholding and is equally recognized in building a new South Africa. And another last important point I'd like to make, as you know, South Africa was a very divided society with a very painful and bloody past under the apartheid regime, where a number of our leaders were killed, incarcerated, imprisoned, and many perished over the years under apartheid rule. So in order to heal the country, it was President Mandela and Archbishop Tutu that came out of the idea of having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That yes, we won our freedom and we have a free democratic dispensation in South Africa in 1994. But we had to find a platform to hear the stories of the past and come to terms with our past in order to build a successful and united, non-racial, non-sexist South Africa that is reconciled in the various fronts. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed under President Mandela's leadership. And interestingly, he chose a person from the religious community, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to become the chair and to head the TRC. And the TRC today is a model that has been emulated by other countries in the world that has experienced painful past and atrocities that want to come to terms with the past history. The TRC played a very important role in shaping the new South Africa as we work towards reconciliation and nation building. So that, colleagues, is a very broad sweep of the Interfaith organization and the role it played in fighting apartheid and seeking justice and freedom for all South Africans, and understanding that we may belong to different faith communities, we may belong to different religious organizations from within our own religious groupings and across the religious spectrum in South Africa. But there's a common humanity that we all share, which apartheid never respected. And that's the common humanity that we fought for under the Interfaith banner, to create this new democratic dispensation where we are all free and equal, where we can observe our religious practices without fear or intimidation and be proud of our identities, the multifold identities that we carry today as South Africans, first and foremost. So thank you very much for giving me this platform to share with you perspectives on religion under apartheid and the struggle against injustice under the apartheid regime by the Interfaith community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Your Excellency, Ambassador Professor Anil Sooklal, for a marvelous and scholarly presentation on the story of interfaith movement in apartheid South Africa and its role in, getting freedom and reversal of the apartheid state. We will take questions for maybe 15 minutes or so. Since we are a small group, we will have a kind of informal discussion. My request to people would be that if you are asking questions, be very precise and ask a very brief and pointed question rather than giving a lengthy discourse. The presentation and the Q&A session are being recorded and they would be uploaded on our website. So if somebody missed a part of the presentation, that would be available. Before opening to the floor, I will just ask one question. In this whole process, do you ascribe any role to the humanity of one individual, and his name is F.W. de Klerk? If F.W. de Klerk had not been the president by chance in the apartheid regime, was there any possibility of apartheid regime dismantling itself, despite all the democratic and faith forces being pitted against it?
Are we going to take one question at a time, Chair, or will we have a few?
Yeah, we will take one question at a time.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. I come from the liberation movement background, so my answer is going to be tainted from a background of my own struggle credentials and my political affiliation to the African National Congress. You see, when the F.W. de Klerk government released Nelson Mandela, there were certain things that had transpired, as I indicated, not just within South Africa, but internationally. South Africa became an isolated state because globally, the political pressure against South Africa and its continued apartheid practices were being opposed by not only the multilateral bodies, the United Nations, the Organization of African Unity, and also individually by countries. South Africa found itself increasingly isolated. This also impacted in trade. South Africa was on the verge of bankruptcy because it was so isolated. So you had a broken state that existed towards the end of the 80s. And the political momentum opposing apartheid had reached such a level that the apartheid regime could not continue sustaining that regime because there was this mass internal movement, as I indicated, United Democratic Front, later the Mass Democratic Movement also that was formed. And all of these factors played a role, and the National Party regime recognized that it could not continue sustaining an apartheid regime. At the same time, what was not known, there were behind the scenes contact. As much as the African National Congress and other liberation movements remained banned as banned organizations by the apartheid regime, there was backroom contact between the leadership of the National Party and the African National Congress. This started in the late 80s. Talks already started between these two main entities to see how they could work together for a democratic dispensation. So de Klerk was the face of bringing about the change. And of course, he must be recognized that he took the bold decision. And that's why the Nobel Peace Prize that was awarded to President Mandela was shared with him in recognition of the reconciliatory stance that they took. Because remember, South Africa could have gone two ways: transition to a peaceful democratic regime, which is what happened, or you could have had a violent confrontation, because you also had the military wing of the African National Congress and the other liberation movements that was becoming extremely agitated externally and internally. So you could have had a bloodbath, so to say, in South Africa in terms of trying to find a resolution to an unjust regime. So de Klerk will get some credit for being the face that eventually articulated the change in track against moving with the apartheid regime. And the last time the apartheid regime held an election in 1989, it was widely rejected by all of the sectors of South African society. And the recognition was there by the National Party that it was unsustainable in its current form, that you cannot have a white-only government going forward into the 90s. It would never have worked. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor Nanda is raising hand. So Professor Nanda.
Thank you. Anilji, namaskar.
Namaskar.
I'm going to greet you next Sunday for Chamanlalji's centenary.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you.
And today, my apologies. Nepal was there at 7:30 this morning, my time, and they started at 7:15. So my apologies. I couldn't leave them because I was greeting them. So my apologies that I'm late.
Not at all. Pleasure to have you.
Two things very quick because my colleagues want to talk. One is that teaching human rights with the MA PhD students from Graduate School of International Studies and law students together, TRC is the one that I put a great deal of emphasis on, and thank you. And finally, I want to simply say that in this country, interfaith groups, they are of varied structure and of varied status. Here in Colorado, we have got Interfaith Alliance of Colorado. And this year, our budget is $1.1 million. So it's a pretty robust organization. I'm the vice president of it, and I have been on it for about 9 years. It does a lot of things from the legislation to others, and it's a very progressive body. And the second group here is the leaders of these communities. These are all these Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and our Hindu temple. And I sit on that, and we work with the governor, and it is a pretty robust organization, but it kind of varies all over. I simply wanted to say namaskar to you, and I have questions, but I won't ask because my colleagues are there. I don't want to take their time, but I'll greet you next Sunday. And Pathakji also is involved in it. And we have had on every continent. And in Asia, we had Indonesia, we had Thailand, we had India, we had Nepal. So about 10, 11 celebrations are already there. And on the 27th, the Prime Minister, the Vice President, all these people are going to be there. So I'm looking forward to greeting you at that time. So my Sada Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you. Namaskar. I've listened to you. I'm sure you were at the first GoPio in 1989 in New York.
I was. And
I was a speaker there as well. I was the only South African.
I remember that.
And I still remember that as a very memorable and important meeting in New York. It was, let me just say, I'm so pleased that you have your interfaith organization and you have a budget of 1.1 million. One of the factors that inhibited the activities of the interfaith organization in South Africa was lack of resources, financial resources. But we did have a national organizer because religious organizations from across the communities were very reluctant to put resources because they were afraid of the apartheid regime, that they were supporting an entity that was opposing the regime. The South African Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches gave us a lot of support. Churches from Germany and the Netherlands also gave us a lot of support that made possible our activities because we used the various international platforms to go and champion the cause. I referred to the Fourth World Assembly that took place in Nairobi. And our presence there ensured that the Nairobi Declaration contained a phrase pertaining to South Africa. And I just want to read what that declaration says, specifically to referring to South Africa. The affront to human dignity of the apartheid regime in South Africa calls us to repudiate separation and division and to seek the community of all races. And it was precisely because we were there under the leadership of Desmond Tutu that the Nairobi Declaration brought focus to the unjust apartheid system in South Africa through the Interfaith organization. So the Interfaith organization played an important role and has an important role to continue to play in the national reconciliation process, not just in South Africa, but I think globally, as communities become more and more introverted and the rise of populism and what is happening amongst Asian Americans, I see, for example, in USA today, is very disturbing. And I believe organizations such as yours and ours have an important role to play in healing societies and bringing societies together in terms of our common understanding and our common humanity. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. I was teaching at Cape and talked about TRC when Desmond Tutu was chairing at that time. And sometime later, I'll talk with you because I had students who were very much opposed to it. But anyway, namaskar.
Namaskar.
So we are open to more questions. And okay, Krishna.
Oh, Anilji, thank you very much for giving us your valuable time. All I can say is your work is a testament to your integrity and your principles. I have one question, actually. I see your past work as to dismantle apartheid. That's one part of the whole interfaith organization's work. In future, how do you see the interfaith organization working towards giving better opportunities to the very vulnerable section of the society? How is it working, actually?
Thank you, Krishna ji, for that question. Let me say that, as I indicated, under Archbishop Tutu and Alan Busak, you had formulated a theology of liberation, articulating a Christian perspective of liberation theology. Within the Muslim community, you had people like Farid Isaac and Ibrahim Rashid from the Muslim Youth Movement, Ibrahim Rasool and Rashid from the Muslim Youth Movement, who also articulated a theology of liberation from an Islamic perspective. Within the Hindu community, we did not have that, unfortunately. And that's precisely because under the apartheid regime, we also didn't have the academic study of Hinduism. You had a Department of Islamic Studies at the University of Durban, Westville, for example. You had a faculty of theology, even though it was an Indian university, and over 75%, 80% of Indian South Africans were not of the Christian faith. But you had a fully fledged faculty of theology because the ideology of the apartheid regime was to Christianize the Indian. And therefore you had a lot of conversion taking place. They used many coercive measures, including financial measures and other measures like ensuring that the top jobs were kept for those Indians that upheld the apartheid regime and upheld the policies of the regime, and they were rewarded. And it was difficult, even for me, when I became a scholar of Hinduism. My whole approach to opposing apartheid was informed first and foremost by the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna standing up for justice against injustice in the fight against the Kaurava and the Pandavas. That was my first point of reference. And being a student of the Gita, I could not understand how we as Hindus would keep quiet and allow the injustices around us to prevail. I would read the statements coming from Christian leaders. I would read the statements in the press from Muslim leaders. And I would ask myself, why are we Hindus saying nothing about this inhumane practice of killing people, of incarcerating people, of torturing people? And the other major influence, of course, was Sri Aurobindo. And as you know, Sri Aurobindo was first and foremost a political entity before he formed the Aurobindo ashram and Auroville and so forth that came later. But if you look at the writings of Sri Aurobindo, highly political. And if you look at the writings of Swami Vivekananda, of course, also had a major impact on my life in terms of Daridya Narayana, that you see God first and foremost in the individual. God is not in the temples, in the images. God is in front of you each day. And if the God in front of you is violated by an apartheid regime, you cannot keep quiet. Then you cannot be a true believer in the Gita. You cannot be a true, and Gandhi himself used the Gita as the basis of his ahimsa and satyagraha philosophy. So what we saw, and I started articulating, and I wrote a number of articles, and perhaps was the only Hindu scholar in South Africa at that stage. I wrote as early as in the late 80s, an article on human rights and the education crisis in South Africa, because our education system was also based along apartheid lines. And this was an article my wife and I co-authored. My wife also lectured in the Department of Science of Religion at the university. And then I wrote an article on social institutions and national unity, looking at the very question of social cohesion from a Hindu perspective. And then I authored an article on Hinduism and the rehumanizing of South Africa, which was published in the Journal for the Study of Religion. And I also authored an article on Neo-Vedanta and human rights, which was also published in a journal for the Journal of Religious Studies. So I tried to articulate a so-called theology of liberation from an Hindu perspective based on what was happening in South Africa. And unfortunately, we did not have much of those because people were afraid to even write and publish anything condemning the apartheid regime because you were afraid that you would be incarcerated or you would be banned, whatever the case may be. Now, the Interfaith organization has an important role to play. National reconciliation and healing in South Africa is an intergenerational process. We are still just 27 years young. It's a very new democratic society. We have been so stratified, not just in terms of race, but in terms of our religion, our language, our culture. And we are learning to integrate and we are learning to appreciate each other. So the TRC that Prof. Nanda referred to was an important instrument to set us on the path of reconciliation. And the Interfaith organization going forward has an important role to play in terms of educating the South African populace about each other, learning about each other, and really truly becoming the rainbow nation that Archbishop Tutu has envisaged and spoken of, and the nation, rainbow nation that President Mandela envisaged, where all South Africans are equal and South Africa belongs equally to all of us, irrespective of our race or religion. And religion can be a powerful force for that ongoing reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you for your answers.
We have time for 2 more questions. Anyone? Okay, if there are no questions, we again thank Professor. Oh, Carl, yes, you have a question. Go ahead.
Professor Sooklal, I just wondered, you mentioned Calvinism being the state religion that created a theology that supported apartheid. And that was the case also over here with slavery. There were many other denominations that had the same thing. Today, though, if you ask a Calvinist over here in the United States, they completely disavow any support for that kind of ideology. So obviously, there's some kind of religious reform that happens in the wake of these political movements. Do you see that happening in South Africa amongst the Christian denominations, Islamic denominations, Hindu denominations? Do you see that kind of thing happening? And also, if there's any role at all for indigenous African religions in South Africa, I don't hear much of that at all.
Thank you so much for that question, Carl. Let me start with the last point first. The indigenous African religions were very much part of the Interfaith organization. We had representation from them. And the indigenous African religions are still very much alive. They were scorned by the apartheid religion, didn't recognize them as fully fledged entities. And yet it's a rich part of South Africa's history and a very dynamic part of South Africa's history. And they today play an important role in South African society. What you saw post-apartheid is that The Calvinist white Dutch Reformed Church was by and large dismantled because you don't have churches segregated along religious lines anymore. As I indicated, since the founding of the white Dutch Reformed Church, you had the colored, the African, and the Indian. They don't exist in that form today. You have totally integrated churches today, even within the Reformed Church. And as I indicated, Alan Busak came from the Reformed tradition, and he became president of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches that totally disowned the theology of the white Dutch Reformed Church. So you have seen reform, and you have seen this in all faiths. What happens within the majority Christian faith cannot but impact positively on the other religious communities because they call into account. You see a number from across the board, from all religions. You had people that were complicit in working with the apartheid religion, including the Hindu community. It was a tragedy that in 1984, when the tricameral parliament was launched, that the Mahasabha that had wonderful historical beginnings under Swami Shankarananda in 1912, that in 1984, the president of the South African Mahasabha and the Secretary General of the Mahasabha went on to to be representatives in this tricameral parliament. They were so-called sellouts by the community, And it was a great embarrassment for us. And that is why we launched the Hindu Students Association in 1982. It was the youth that became the force within the Hindu community to start articulating that Hindus are not complicit in this apartheid regime, that Hindu philosophy, Hindu theology, if I can refer to it as such, has a very strong liberation dimension in terms of opposing all forms of oppression against the human being. As I said, the human being is God, is divine. And there's no way that we can say that we are Hindus and we belong to organized Hindu mainstream religions and we don't speak out against this. In 1989, you had a mass movement throughout the country where they called on all of the communities to march in September 1989. And I'll give you an example of the difficulty I had. My wife and I went to all of the main Hindu religious organizations because the march was to be led in Durban, like in the other cities as well. It was simultaneously happening by religious leaders. And I went and asked, I said, we need a saffron-clad person to work with the Christian leaders, with the pastors, with the Molanas, and with the rabbis to hold hands together and lead this march. Not one Hindu organization came forward to join this march. And for me, that was part of the painful past of our history. These organizations did a lot of good work. In terms of humanitarian work, you can't fault them. They worked assiduously in uplifting the plight, especially of the African community, in terms of humanitarian work, building schools, building clinics, running clinics and offering free medical assistance, ensuring that poverty is addressed. They did fantastic humanitarian work. But I was told point blank by one of our swamis, religion and politics don't mix and you will not see us marching there. And we had to do that as Hindu students, as leaders of the student organization to show that Hinduism also has a role to play in opposing and dismantling apartheid. And we must continue along this vein, working with our other faith communities.
So we have our last question by Professor Yashwant Pathak. Professor Pathak.
Yeah, I'm going to be very, Dr. Anil, you have been a strong activist in the beginning, then you became a lecturer, so you must have been mellowing down, and now you are in establishment. How do you keep your activist mind still alive?
Well, once you're an activist, you're always an activist. It never leaves you. And I think the day your philosophy of activism leaves you, you're the poorer for it. Because activism means creating a better world and a better society and a better community. And I think that's inbred into my psyche. As I said, I'm nourished by my faith, by Hindu philosophy and religion. I'm nourished by the Interfaith organization that believes that all of humanity is part of one family. And as I said, we still have tremendous challenges in South Africa today. And we have to work as a collective in addressing the challenges of South Africa, the challenges of our African continent, and of course, the global challenges that we have today, where we are seeing the fault lines becoming sharper rather than them becoming blurred and us creating a society where we can all coexist peacefully. So yeah, I would say that I'll always be an activist.
Hey, thank you, Anil. I'm so honored to be associated with you for 30 long years now.
My privilege, Yashwant.
So with that being the last question, on behalf of International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom, we thank Ambassador Professor Anil Sooklal with bottom of our hearts for an excellent and very scholarly presentation. I must say this is only the first presentation, but not necessarily the last presentation. We will keep on inviting you to our meetings, symposia, events, etc. And for everyone else, this meeting, including the question and answer sessions, have been recorded and they will be uploaded on our website so people can refer to it. And again, thank you very much indeed. And with that, we will end this meeting. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you for your time, sir.
Namaste.
Thank you
very much. Bye.
Thank you.
See you next Sunday.
We'll see you next Sunday, Prof. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.